Welcome to Finlos Teaches. Public schools are essential components to our communities. They serve as neighborhood hubs, sources of entertainment and recreation, launch pads for education and careers. And as the COVID-19 pandemic recently reminded us, necessary childcare to allow parents to participate in economic activities. Something that may be forgotten, however, is that many schools are also built as disaster shelters, designed to withstand extreme elements and offer security and comfort during and after natural disasters. Florida is no stranger to such disasters, and just last month, the middle of the state was battered by Hurricane Ian. I reached out to a colleague of mine, Nicholas Troyer, who lives in Northport, Florida, to check in to see how he and his family are doing after the storm. His school serves as one such disaster shelter, so he has direct experience with severe storms and their aftermaths. In this episode, I share our conversation.
So thank you so much for doing this. I'm sure it's crazy there. Are in your neighborhood at least, are things kind of starting to settle?
Yeah, in my area, we didn't really get affected by Ian as severely as other places in my city, and definitely not as severe as some places south of the city. But yeah, for a time there, about 5 or 6 day stretch, it was looking pretty dicey.
Mm-hmm.
But at this point, actually, some places in our city, it looks like nothing's ever happened. It's a little surreal.
And what city exactly are you in?
So I'm living in Northport, Florida.
Okay.
It's about a half hour south of Sarasota, which most people know a lot better than Northport.
But you were without power for a little bit, weren't you?
Yeah, about 5 days.
Yeah, it's crazy, man. And so just as far as your survey of the towns in your area, I mean, what's kind of the variety of things that you've seen?
So Northport, which is something I never really noticed before until this storm, but Northport actually has a lot of rivers and creeks running through it. And we have a lot of control weir systems to kind of keep the river levels appropriate. And the storm pretty much overwhelmed all of those. And there were areas of town that were completely submerged underwater from the flooding, and areas that were just totally inaccessible. And where I live in the city, I'm surrounded by 3 bridges. Three of the different ways to get out of the neighborhood are bridges, and all of those were either submerged or demolished from the flooding. And so for a while, some neighborhoods in the city were pretty much stranded.
Wow, it's nuts.
There was no way in or out for a couple days.
Yeah, and I was keeping up with you via Facebook and things like that, and I know that you were struggling to find like gasoline and stuff like that to keep the generators going. But at one point you said you stayed at your house, but your family kind of went to another town where there was electricity.
Yeah, so the three ways to get out were totally either blocked off because the bridges were broken or still under at least 6 feet of water. The only way to get out was to go the fourth way, which is not over a bridge, and leads to an interstate. But most of that road was under a little bit of water. It looked dicey, but it was sedans and smaller cars were getting through. So we were able to get through with an SUV. So my dad and I, we decided nothing was going to be open in Northport because of the damage. And most of if not all the city was without power still. So it made more sense to us to go north on the interstate if we could get out to Sarasota, which got hit pretty hard, but not nearly as hard. And so we were able to get up there and do a Publix run. The Publix up there seemed like nothing had ever happened. They were just running as normal. We were able to find propane for our generators, and then we got back home. And then about 2 hours after we got back home, we got a news alert that some of the interstate in our area where we were just traveling was also underwater because the flooding north of us in the Myakkahatchee River just had tipped over the levee or the dam or whatever the system in place over there was, and just started flooding down. So there were parts of the interstate even that were just totally underwater. And we're maybe an hour or two away from when that happened.
And I know, I mean, when you think in retrospect, right, it seems like compared to what other people had to go through, small stuff. But I mean, you had just finished, or you're still maybe in the process of renovating your house, aren't you? So like, what were you thinking as you were preparing for the storm and just considering how to get ready for it?
There's a lot of anxiety. The house was built in '05 that we live in, so I was pretty confident it could withstand, most hurricane force things. It seemed like it was up to code and all that good stuff. The windows in the house are a little rickety, so we didn't trust them. We boarded those up. But we do have a new area of the house that we had added on that we had put hurricane impact windows and stuff. So we felt pretty confident about that. But even then, when we saw the category of the storm that was going to be hitting our area, it was too late to do anything about it at that point, but we were pretty nervous about it. It did create a really unique situation where I could watch the storm happen, and I could watch the 9 or 10 hours of being in a Category 4 storm wall, which was pretty dicey. When the squalls would come through or the gusts would come through, and then just the window goes white, and you don't know what's going to happen or if anything's going to fly through. But yeah, we had my family, which is my wife and I and my 2 kids. And they had my parents because they live in a mobile home in Sarasota, and so we had 6 people in our house, and we're just riding out the storm, not really sure what was going to happen.
Yeah, there's few things like being in the middle of one of those storms. I mean, it's definitely one of those humbling experiences when you realize just how powerful those forces of nature can be, and then when you see the aftermath, and it's just crazy. I was watching some of the footage, and I'm really glad that you didn't get the worst of it, even though you did get some pretty bad stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the worst is always going to be the storm surge, and the way the storm was spinning, it was pulling all the water out north of us and pushing it all south of us. So we're in this nice Northport's a pretty coastal town. I mean, port is in the name, but that's because it's north of Port Charlotte, and we're like right on that county line of Port Charlotte. And so when you start hearing the news that Port Charlotte's going to get 18 feet of storm surge, you start, okay, how much is going to come to us, even though we're not really near water?
Tell me a little bit about your school. Like when you're not worrying about hurricanes, what are some of the features of your school that stand out to you?
Sure. I'm starting my 7th year. Well, we're in the second quarter. I'm in my 7th year of this school, and we're pretty diverse. We have the either largest or second largest student population in the county, depending on enrollment at any given time. It's always neck and neck with another school in Sarasota. But we have I want to say 2,600 students on campus. It's a beautiful open campus. So there's grass and wilderness and wildlife all kind of around. My classroom's kind of tucked away in a corner near the woods. So a little gopher tortoise family will pop out every once in a while under the fence to come out and get a grass snack, and the kids are always like stopping in amazement of it, like they've never seen a tortoise before.
Right.
But it's just, you're on campus at school, you don't think to see it.
Do you feel like you have a really strong connection to the school and your campus and your students?
Yeah, this is when I graduated, I moved down here to start working at the school. This is the only school I've professionally worked at. So it's been, the entirety of my relatively short teaching career has been here.
So you've mentioned before your school in times of hurricanes and things like that functions as a shelter. Can you
Yes.
talk a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, so when Hurricane Irma came through this area along a similar path, my wife and I, who also teaches at the school, my wife and I decided to go to the school as it turned into a shelter. We didn't expect much of it. We thought we would just kind of post up in one of our classrooms and ride out the storm like we would have at home. But we quickly found out that when a school turns into a hurricane shelter, oftentimes it's up to the school staff that decided to show up to kind of operate it, which in hindsight, it makes sense. We have the keys to everything. We know where everything is. We're familiar with every inch of the campus. But it was a real culture shock to my wife and I when Hurricane Irma came through and we opened up as a shelter. If I'm remembering correctly, I want to say we had 3,000 citizens in the city come to the high school to go to the shelter, and they were pretty jam-packed in there. And we overflowed the classrooms. We had people just in the gym on the basketball court, just spread out
So when you say like in the classroom serving as a shelter, like the rooms themselves, there's people sleeping in the classrooms.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, you push as much of the classroom furniture out of the way as possible and make space and literally just live inside of a high school classroom.
And when you say the staff and the faculty are kind of managing things, talk about some of the stuff that you did while you were there.
Sure. Well, we did citizen check-in, so we were responsible for writing down information and signing in people who were coming into the shelter to keep records. We were responsible for food delivery, not food cooking. We did have some nutritionists or nutritional specialists. Our cafeteria personnel came in and cooked the food that was there, but staff were literally taking food on the old AV carts where the teacher would wheel in the TV back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
We were just taking those full of Uncrustables and cooked food and meals and just going classroom to classroom as giving out as much as we could. We were managing the storm during the storm. So there were often times where debris would be flying around or something as we were trying to tuck things away or check people in. And we had to kind of, because we have the keys to things, we'd go, that their side paneling just flew off and almost hit me in the head. I'll just take that and stuff it in a closet somewhere. We'll deal with that later.
Wow.
We were also one of the only shelters in the area for animals. And so our gym was filled with people, but the back hallways to the locker rooms, all of the gym locker rooms were for animals. Mm-hmm. So we had like basically a dog kennel and then an area for cats. We tried to keep them separated. And then there was an exotic pet area, which we weren't really supposed to take, but we couldn't really turn people away at that point because the storm was bearing down on everybody.
Well, just for examples, what kind of exotic pets were you getting?
I mean, exotic sounds a little over dramatic, but you get like iguanas or something like that.
Okay.
Nothing too insane. But we would be taking in these animals and people would be coming, and they're coming last minute. School, when Irma came, we had a half day on Thursday, and then the school opened at like 9 a.m. Friday as a shelter. Mm-hmm. And then the storm came Friday night. So people were coming pretty last minute. People were bringing animals but had nothing to cage them in or keep them in. So we were relying on donations from random people in the city that would come and bring us, just cages of all shapes and sizes to help keep these animals in one spot to keep them safe.
So yeah, it's a lot of. It is interesting. Not interesting. That's not the right word. It's always really heartening how quickly community comes together in these times of need, and when you're having to experience these really traumatic shifts in how we're living our lives, especially when you're talking about staying in schools. Were your experiences with people generally positive?
Everyone was really thankful. Everyone was really appreciative of having a place to stay. But as the hurricane wore on and kind of the worst of the storm had passed, it was really quick that people didn't want to stay there anymore. Mm-hmm. So you're having people, overnight Friday, a little bit even overnight Saturday, just wanting to go home. And we had a few National Guard vehicles had shown up for Irma, and they had kind of posted out on the entrance and exits of the school and said, no, you can't leave until it's safe. The roads aren't clear. It's not safe to let you go. So you had people, they're stir crazy. They don't want to live in the high school. They think it's safe. They want to go home. They want to see the damages. They're eager to get things back together. But when you have 3,000 people like that, and you have like 12 teachers and a couple principals are the people running it, this is not a recipe for a good time.
No, for sure. And now with the recent experience with Ian, did your school again kind of function as a shelter?
It did, but with having two kids, my wife and I decided not to go this time. Mm-hmm. With our experience with Irma, knowing the responsibilities we would likely have to take on if we went, it just didn't seem right bringing our 3-year-old and 8-month-old.
Sure.
So we decided not to go this time, but it did act as a shelter. The storm for Ian, obviously being worse than Irma was, the school, it took a harder hit. I was told that they lost power pretty early in, which must mean also the backup power because the school functions with backup power as well. But they lost power at some point during the storm. They lost the water, which means people couldn't use the restroom anymore. or at least not flush or wash hands, keep sanitary.
Mm-hmm.
The food that we had kept or was planning to use had gone bad, had spoiled. And so people eventually had to evacuate to a North County shelter in a different school up in Sarasota. Like county buses and school buses took them all to the next shelter.
Mm-hmm.
This happened for some groups a couple times. A friend of mine who used to work with me, her husband is an SRO that was working at one of the elementary schools for the shelter. And he and his group had moved from that shelter to my school, from my school to another school, and then from that school to a fourth school before people were finally able to go back to their homes. So, a week and a half or 2 weeks into the storm recovery, most of the town's kind of getting by and recuperating and getting ready to get on with their lives, as stressful and as hard as it was. And then, you have people just getting home and surveying their damage for the very first time.
Talk about the note that you left on your board and how the people who stayed in your class responded to that.
Sure. So this goes back to Irma. When we realized Irma was going to be a shelter and I knew I wasn't going to be staying in my own room, I decided to leave a note on the whiteboard that just generally opened up my classroom and supplies to people. When families come to stay, there's always kids, there's children. As teachers, we work with children, so we're kind of probably a little more sensitive to that. So basically, during Irma, I left a message that, hey, there's markers, there's crayons, there's colored pencils, there's laptops, there's a smart board. You're going to be stuck here for a couple days. Try to be as comfortable as you can. And the people in my room responded really well. They left me a really sweet letter, made me tear up a little bit. That basically said, thank you for letting us take your space. And this was a really scary event where nobody knew what was going to happen or if we'd get to go back to our homes or not. And it was really nice to have, a safe place to be with supplies and things to kind of keep them entertained during it.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, not every class of the school made it out so well during Irma. There are a lot of instances of bodily fluids and human waste in parts of the school.
Yeah.
There's cigarette butts all over the place, which, that's pretty simple to clean up, but people were smoking in the buildings because they weren't allowed to go outside.
Mm-hmm.
And there was instances of supplies and things going missing and personal items of teachers going missing. So the school kind of had a bad taste in its mouth when we opened up for Ian, but my room was fine for Irma. I didn't have that issues. I had really great people and they were really compassionate. So when Ian opened up, I left basically the same note. And when I came back, they had left a note on the whiteboard again saying, thank you. We had 22 shelter seekers in here. We really appreciated you letting us take your space. And they said, sorry for the mess. But to be honest, by the time I got there, and probably thanks to the custodial staff, there was no mess. It was my room was virtually untouched by damage from the storm.
Mm-hmm.
There was some flooding on the school. Didn't seem to affect my room at all. All my tables were clean. All the stuff was clean. I just had to move some furniture around.
That's awesome. So this was your first week back after how long was your school closed?
We were closed from September 28th until the 17th of October.
Okay, and so this was your first week back. How were the students? What was your experience this week?
They were in pretty good spirits. I had sent out a message over the Remind app the day before, kind of like it was the picture of Kevin from Home Alone, and he's got his hands on his face doing the expression.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, school's tomorrow, just trying to be tongue-in-cheek about it. And I got a lot of eye roll emojis and ughs and oh no's. So their determination to not really want to do anything hadn't been affected. But no, they came back in good spirits. They're pretty happy to be back, I think. A little sense of routine. I had sent out a survey to them that kind of asked, are you still able to live in your home? Do you have power? Do you have internet? Do you think your attendance will be affected?
Mm-hmm.
We're already short on bus drivers and some bridges are still down. Do you think you'll be able to get to school on time? And they filled those out. They responded pretty well. Thankfully, most of my students were not affected. I do have a handful of students that basically have lost everything, and a handful of colleagues as well.
Yeah, and I mean, coming after so soon after the pandemic, when things were still, I can only imagine, for you this year, things feeling like you're still trying to get back into routine. It's only all these interruptions just make it harder and harder. How do you feel this year professionally as a teacher, do you feel still energized? Do you still have the excitement about what you're doing?
For the most part, yes, but underneath that is a lot of frustration. When COVID-19 started, when the pandemic happened, it was March of 2020. All our schools locked down in our county, and obviously a lot of other places, basically the whole globe. But our county locked down for the entire fourth quarter of school. And then when we opened back up late next school year, it was a hybrid model. So I had a full classroom in the class, but I was also teaching via Zoom simultaneously to kids at home, which was a model that did not work very well. It was a great idea, but it just didn't pan out. Personally, I think it would have worked better if we could have managed it to have in-person classes and then a whole other teacher doing just digital classes to keep digital classroom management going. But our system was a great stopgap, but it didn't really fix anything or help. And then when we came back last year for just regular school, you could see the differences in the students. You could see the behavior differences. You could see the maturity differences of students who basically missed out on a year and a half of middle school entering high school for the first time. Some of them entering for the high school for the first time as sophomores. And it just made things really difficult. And then this year we were all kind of under the impression like, all right, things are kind of back to normal. We've gone a couple years of this. I think we've gotten through it. Now it's time to start patching up all the things that we notice and kind of trying to address the issues. And then right in the middle of the first quarter, boom, hurricane, no school for 2 weeks. Yeah. Some of you don't have houses.
So how are you, what are you telling your students? How are you dealing with all of these needs for flexibility, with all of this sort of discontinuity?
Well, with all the students I have across my classes, I'm up to about 141. It's hard to go on a case by case, like, hey, what do you need? What do you need? I've noticed you need this, but that's kind of the job. So in the background of every lesson I give, in the background of every, assignment that we're doing, I'm monitoring, I'm looking for any signs of, need. I mean, the obvious needs for my students that don't have, homes or school supplies, it's pretty, what I'm able to do is pretty easy to do. I can give them school supplies. I can pass along information to get free reduced lunch or free meals from local people giving out food for people in need. But for those larger issues, how they deal with the anxiety or the uncertainty or, am I going to graduate high school? How does this affect going to college? That kind of stuff. It's really difficult.
Yeah, well, I know that it's not an easy job, but I just, from my experience in the classroom, it's that they are so appreciative of just knowing that their teachers are going to be there, that there is some stability that they can look forward to. So it's such an important job. All right. Well, thank you so much for giving me a few minutes of your time. I hope that the rest of the school year kind of ends up normally, calmly.
Yes. That would be nice.
That would be great.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much.
So much of how we discuss schools limits their importance and impact within our communities. And by extension, when we neglect to consider the diverse roles that schools play, we also tend to do the same to our teachers. Teachers aren't simply modestly paid child caretakers. Teachers are essential frontline workers who educate and care for our children. They are also emergency personnel, providers of comfort and stability, and sometimes the best people for identifying children in crisis, especially in the wake of upheaval or disaster. As we try to move into a future where COVID-19 is endemic, a regularly occurring part of life, teachers will be adding that reality to the already over-full portfolio of concerns for which to monitor and report. And teachers will do it, professionally, gracefully, while continuing to offer the continuity and structure that is the foundation of public education. And when the wind and rains come, when the floods come, when the fires come, teachers will keep the lights on. That's it for this episode. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me via social media or send me an email to finloslives@gmail.com. Or you can leave me a voicemail with the SpeakPipe app at finloslives.com. Also at that website is the entire catalog of prior episodes, as well as a thank you page dedicated to the podcast subscribers and supporters. You can become a supporter at patreon.com/finloslives or via the link on our website. I look forward to our next conversation. Thanks for joining me.